What's inspiring you these days with your soccer league?
Everything. The world is ready for women's sports, and in particular the National Women's Soccer League, to unlock our potential. And I've described the experience of taking on this role over the last 14 months as running a marathon, and you have all the people on the sidelines like cheering for you, passing you water, giving you orange slices, running along with you. That's what it feels like. It feels like the world is rooting for us, and it's an incredible opportunity to really show everyone what's possible when we give women the resources they need to be successful.
John, it's great to meet yet another colleague who has superseded your career, even though
Yes,
you were
absolutely.
That's part one. And part two, Jessica, just for full transparency, I do write for The Athletic, so obviously I'm very familiar with your league, and obviously I have a lot of colleagues who cover you guys. I've covered women's basketball for a long time, first with Sports Illustrated and then a little bit with The Athletic, although we have full-time people there. And one of the things that has been fascinating to me has been hearing how Kathy Engelbert has discussed the expansion project for them in terms of how they've gone about taking a potential list of 100 cities and then narrowing that down through data, through investment, through ownership to get to where they ultimately hope to be. You've already announced expansion plans. And so I want to ask you, it must have been a really laborious process. And what were you and the management group, what were you specifically looking for when it came to potential cities to invest and to be part of your league?
Yeah, it's a great question. We really look at expansion through three lenses. There's the ownership, the market, and the facilities. And each of those has some component parts. But most importantly, from our perspective, because our geographic footprint is still relatively small, the markets where the NWSL could be successful are larger and more varied than some of the other factors. And so the decision making is really much more driven by ownership, both quality of ownership as well as the desire to invest in the NWSL as a business, and then the facilities, both from a stadium and game perspective as well as training facilities. And those are unique issues, I'd say, to women's sports, where we really have to be thoughtful about how and the ways in which we're providing opportunities for our athletes to train.
One follow-up there, Jessica, and then John, you feel free to take over. The interesting thing to me about your league is that there might have been a preconceived notion that your league might not be successful if you went to a market like Los Angeles where you're flooded with all professional sports teams. Obviously, Angel City's proven that is not the case. And so do you use that as proof of concept a little bit that if again, all this, if Boston turns out to be an expansion city, or name your other U.S. city that has 4 or 5 professional sports teams, it feels to me that Angel City now is proof of concept that you don't necessarily have to go to a city that doesn't have any pro teams. There's an audience for your sport, I think, in major cities.
I think it's a perfect proof of concept that, in fact, the historical ways of measuring the ultimate potential success of women's sports shouldn't be measured against men's sports. We have a very different value proposition and a very different audience. And so we actually don't find, even with our teams that are jointly owned by MLS teams, that there's a ton of overlap between our fans and men's sports fans. It's an entirely net new audience. And so to think that in order to enter a cluttered sports marketplace, it meant we were taking fans away from men's sports is just not what the data actually has told us, which is that we reach an audience of people who tend to think of themselves as disenfranchised from the traditional sports ecosystem. They aren't historically engaged in men's sports. So it's a net new audience for sponsors, for media. And that's one of the value propositions that we're really unlocking as we build this business for the future.
Is that a positive or a negative when you sell it to business partners and sponsors?
It's a huge positive because our fans show up in different ways. First of all, we find that our fans are younger. They're more digitally savvy, mostly because they had to be, because our broadcasts, our games, our content wasn't easily findable for a very long time. And arguably still is less findable, less discoverable than men's sports. So our fans have had to get super smart and active in terms of engaging with our content. And that's a huge benefit from a sponsorship perspective. It also allows for us to demonstrate that our fans are really invested in our league. They actually make an active effort to find us. We really don't have a complacent fan, because there really hasn't been a way to consume women's sports or the NWSL by just sitting on your couch and turning on your TV. You had to be intentional about finding it.
And yet, I mean, to be the devil's advocate, and that is that, you know, your sojourn onto CBS last year was a huge positive for you. So in the end, you still need the traditional broadcast platforms in order to, well, quote unquote, grow the game, right?
Absolutely. And actually what that showed us, and it's the same thing we learned through our championship, where we pulled almost 1 million viewers up against game 1 of the World Series in college football. And when you look at the NCAA tournament for women's basketball, we learned that when you put women's sports in places and spaces where consumers and viewers watch, that people are actually interested in it. And so we think both can be true. Like, we can transcend the mainstream by changing the way that we distribute our content. And we also have a unique value proposition in terms of our historical data about the ways in which our consumers and fans engage with our game.
So what do you view then as your competition?
Any forms of entertainment, any forms of culture consumption. We really think of ourselves as a form of culture and entertainment more than anything else. And because of the gender equity movement and what our athletes represent, it actually appeals to people like my mom, who don't actually watch sports, but she's interested in watching our athletes because they stand for more than just being soccer players, just by demonstrating their excellence on the pitch. And therefore we think of ourselves as a much broader entertainment property.
You know, one of the really important roles of any commissioner is to figure out where broadcast, I'll use that with a capital B, is going. You guys are all smart enough to know that, like, the cable ecosystem in the United States is declining. Streaming obviously is a major factor, but we'll see who sort of eventually shakes out in terms of the streamers. So when you're looking at the league long term, you have to get the product to people. So you have to sort of figure out, obviously, where it's going to be. Do you just have any thoughts as to, I know, I'm sure you're very happy with CBS and Paramount Plus, but, like, do you have thoughts as to, like, maybe ideally where this may be for you guys in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, we have been happy with the sort of foundation we have with CBS, but we know we can do better. And we're in the final year of a multi-year deal. And, you know, that deal was struck at a time when the league was in a very different place. So yes, we are talking to CBS about what the future looks like with them. And we're also talking to others. So in 2024, we will in fact have a new media deal. And a lot of the discussions and the strategy work that's ongoing behind the curtain at the league office is really thinking about the future of the NWSL. And we think about it through 3 considerations, what we call the 3 R's: revenue, reach, and relevance. And with the fragmented space that has unfolded over the last several years in the media landscape, we know that oftentimes those considerations have friction and there are trade-offs with each of them. And we're at a growth stage, a high growth stage in our development and in our number of years of existence as a league. And so we have a lot of really important decisions to make in the coming months.